So pretend you're seeing the first slide, which is a still shot frame of Zelensky giving a speech in the night during the war, okay? And so this is this fearless, earnest Russian target number 1, man in green t-shirt. And as Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time, on the screens worldwide, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky captures, of course, the global imagination like no one else. The Kremlin saw him as a pushover. There might have been some Ukrainians who also saw him as such. But the reason behind his success is not Zelensky's special leadership traits that set him apart from his country. Instead, and in fact, what made him and makes him extraordinary in war comes from his very ordinariness as a Ukrainian. As such, he inherits a tradition of dissent and a fierce civic sense that is baked into the country's identity. He is a Ukrainian every person, albeit, obviously, in a way that few others could be. So, next slide, please. The thing is, Zelensky knew things about his fellow Ukrainians in Ukraine that many Ukrainians and scholars of Ukraine already knew as well. He knew that there was a very strong sense of civic identity, which is the last 5 set of bars at the end of this graph. Next slide, please. He also knew that not only did Ukrainians vote for Ukrainian independence in extraordinary large numbers, which we are constantly reminded now, including by people on social media, but he also knew that in those very first years, and especially in that first decade of independence, Ukrainians moved to identify themselves at higher rates as Ukrainians in terms of civic identity. Thank you so much. He also knew this other thing that was incredibly important, that there's a long history of civic engagement and participation in Ukraine, not least the dissidents of the 60s and 70s and 80s. But he also knew that they came from parts of the country, from all parts of the country, such as this map displays, where actually the dissidents of the 70s came from. If you look at this map, you will start noticing that, in fact, the majority of dissidents did not come from the west and only center of Ukraine, as some might have assumed. Not news to any Ukrainian, I think. Not news to Zelensky. He knew, obviously, that multiple times Ukrainians joined mass protests to a very large scale. But most importantly, he knew he himself was part of something called the independence generation. Those Ukrainians who were children around when these folks were protesting on the Maidan, who were somewhere between the age of 7, 8 to 14, 15 or so, and they had living memory of living in the USSR. They had living memory of Ukraine becoming independent. To different degrees and in different ways, they might remember that moment, but nonetheless, they remember it. And then they remember also the mayhem of the 1990s. So why do we know Zelensky knew all these things about his fellow Ukrainians? Because he kept telling us. He kept telling us in his live speeches during the war. He kept telling us in his theatrical performances. And he kept telling us, quite frankly, in this somewhat popular show called Servant of the People, where he played a fictional president himself. He kept referring to these themes, not only in his role as an actor, as an entertainer, but obviously in his role as president. And what Henry and I do in the book also is we look at his speeches in 2019, 2020, and 2021, prior to the war, to look at the sorts of themes that appear there. And these themes do appear there. He talks about the dissidents. He talks about independence. He talks about the import of the independence generation, of which he is. And so while many observers knew him in this capacity, while some, possibly Ukrainians also, knew him in this capacity, whether it was until 2019 for some folks, or whether it was until, in fact, February 24th for others, they missed a huge part of the equation. Zelensky was very much one of the 44 million army, but one that perhaps understood the ordinary Ukrainian in a way that, again, few others could. He mirrored a particular group of civically engaged Ukrainians, specifically Russophone Ukrainians from the southeast, that perhaps did not yet, until 2019, see leaders that exemplified them and their civic duty in the same way that he did. He brought them into the fold, perhaps rallying them to the civic position as well. So when February 24th, 2022, obviously a date etched in all of our memory, occurs, Zelensky and his actions need to be understood through that lens. So far, the Zelensky effect is just simply the fact that Zelensky is one of millions of Zelenskys in the country. So he continues this theme of civic collective identity, of civic democratic duty, and he also displays how a leader, how a good Ukrainian citizen should act. He's not surprised by the detractors, I think. As many Ukrainians themselves have said, our colleague, Professor Harань, also said that his actions emulated that of what any good Ukrainian would have done. And certainly, here's yet another depiction of a good Ukrainian. We do know that about 80% of the Ukrainian population are currently actively engaged in some shape or form in the armed struggle, be it by funding and donating, be it by their own civic engagement, or by other means. But here's this other Zelensky effect. And I think it's incredibly important for us to take note of. First of all, when we look at surveys about around the elections, before and after the presidential elections, we find a very interesting first trend. Young people, specifically young males in this case, who are disenchanted by the state or by democracy, were more likely to vote for Zelensky. People who wanted to leave, migrate, go abroad because they did not see a future for themselves in Ukraine, also voted for Zelensky at higher rates at a statistically significant level. A theme that Zelensky actually explores quite in great detail in much of his speeches, much of his campaign, and to a large extent in Servant of the People, a theme that keeps repeating itself over and over again. What happens to this group after 2019? And we know this because we have panel data that goes to re-interview individuals over the course of the years that follow. And in that panel data, we learn that these people no longer want to leave Ukraine. First weird thing. Then we start seeing a pattern, which is displayed in this graph here, about increased support for democracy as being the best system for Ukraine. In 2019, 39% of Ukrainians thought that democracy was the best system for the country. By February 16th, which is the cutoff of our survey in 2022, just under 60% think that democracy is the best system for their country. Who are the movers? Well, I think you know where I'm going with this. There's a little bit of a Zelensky effect there, in fact. The movers are those people who previously thought that an authoritarian system was the best for their country, that previously thought it was hard to say after 30 years of the democracy experiment, they still thought it was hard to say, or that felt that for people like them, it doesn't matter. These groups all moved in some part, obviously not everyone, but in some part, to believing that democracy is the best system for the country. Who were they? Well, at a statistically significant level, they tended to be people in the southeast. They tended to be people in places like Kherson, like Kharkiv, like Dnipropetrovsk, like Donetsk, like Zaporizhia, like Luhansk. They rallied around democracy, but they also were much more likely to have been voters for Zelensky's party, Servant of the People. They were also more likely to, if they weren't supporters of Zelensky's party, Servant of the People in 2019, they were also more likely to become supporters of this party. These are just some elements of what we think might be the Zelensky effect. There are connections to other liberal dispositions and holding other liberal values, also Euro-Atlantist positions that are statistically correlated to support for Zelensky or having voted for his party. That's one part of the Zelensky effect, yeah? That's a very important part. The book, obviously, is 8 chapters long, covers a great deal more. All of the political history that we could scrummage in there, specifically the fact that time and time again, political leaders let ordinary citizens down. And what did that do? It did not actually move citizens away from democracy, as it turns out, but it did mean that they did not have the same trust in political leaders, that they were disenchanted by the way that politics was run. This doesn't mean that Zelensky did not commit some of these same errors. This does not, we address some of those in the book, but certainly there's something else here, and something truly much more powerful than simply a moving image on the screen. Question?
Yeah, since we originally thought we would only have 8 minutes, we planned for Ola to do the presentation, and then I'd maybe be more active in the question and answer. I guess the only thing that I would sort of add is that kind of Zelensky, in the way that he sort of personifies and represents ordinary Ukrainians, right, as a person of Jewish heritage from southeast Ukraine, yet someone who has consistently advocated pro-European orientations, and then, of course, after the Al-An invasion, was leading the resistance effort. I think kind of sort of gave the lie to Putin's narrative about Ukraine more powerfully than almost anybody else could, because he was precisely the kind of guy who might have been derided, and was derided by many as kind of a Savok, homo sovieticus, yet, you know, the kind of person who Putin and a lot of people around him probably thought wouldn't care enough about the Ukrainian idea to really fight for it, to kind of, give up their lives, yet here he was doing this. And I think that was just a very powerful image, and something that has, it's not just, all of a sudden he decided to take this stand, right? What we trace through the book is that, this is very consistent with his orientation over the years, after some formative period of where he's, I think working out his own views, but, certainly since 2014, but even before that. And I guess the last thing I would just add, maybe just a little bit just on the structure of the book, is that, we wanted the book, to speak to and explain these kind of puzzles or surprises, right? And there were surprises in different ways to different people that, it wasn't a surprise to everybody, right? But that for a lot of people, it was a surprise that Ukrainians would resist the Russian attack so fiercely, and that he himself would appear to be such an effective leader. So we wanted to address that, but also wanted to, mention or kind of put at center what Ola mentioned was the fact that it's not really about him and his personality or exceptional leadership skills, right? It's really about the country and the way that he reflects and kind of reinforces a lot of its main ideas and then represents it. And so that requires a telling of Ukrainian history. And so the book is structured. Basically, it could be useful as a history of Ukraine, we hope, a political history and an identity history of Ukraine, at least of contemporary kind of post-Soviet Ukraine. So each chapter after the introduction is structured around what we call a critical juncture, right, following political science literatures on critical junctures. So we talk about the independence, obtaining of independence as one, the Orange Revolution as another, for example, the Euromaidan, kind of breaking down the stages of politics along these lines, and in each context, we tell the story of kind of what it was like for Zelensky personally, the independence generation more generally, and for the country as a whole, passing through each of these stages. And then once we get to where he enters politics, we have a chapter on how he kind of became a viable presidential candidate, and then on his campaign for the presidency itself, then on his presidency, and then how he performs in war. And then the final chapter speculates about the future that Ukraine might have, given what we try to document. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.